Hello and welcome to the latest edition of BM Talks. I am delighted to be joined today, a returning guest, the expert political scientist Rob Ford, who is an academic at the University of Manchester. Welcome, Rob.
Hi.
And look, I've got you in hot off the press because, of course, we have this important, possibly even more important by-election coming up in Manchester, sort of in your neighbourhood, and I wanted to ask you some questions about that. In fact, I say your neighbourhood, you've got an excellent Substack that I should mention, which is very much worth everybody reading. And I noticed from that we now know that you shop at a Tesco's in this constituency. Is that correct?
Not quite, actually. The Tesco is not in the constituency, but
Oh.
I pass through the constituency when I drive to it.
I apologise. Look at that. I'm misrepresenting you straight away. But look, I do. I think actually, I think it is very important for anyone following this by-election, as indeed with any by-election, but specifically this one, that local knowledge and understanding of the seat is significant because it is a new seat. So, first thing I'm going to ask you, Rob, is tell us about Gorton and Denton. Tell us its electoral history, which in present form isn't much. What do we need to know about this constituency? Where is it? Paint a picture for us.
Well, I mean, the first thing that you want to know about Gorton and Denton, which I think was one of the most important misconceptions down in Westminster that I kind of wrote the Substack to help correct, is Gorton and Denton is less than half of Gorton and Denton, if that makes sense. The name
Okay.
is very misleading. More than half of the electorate are not in the part of the seat that goes under the names of Gorton and Denton. I'm not really sure how that's happened because normally the politics of constituency naming is quite involved, and you end up with about 4 or 5 places listed these days. But the seat is, as you mentioned, a new seat from 2019.
Mm.
It was one of the seats with the highest measures of what psephologists call the index of change. So that's the level of churn, voters coming in, voters going out. It's basically smashed together two chunks of previous seats. The Gorton and Denton bit that gives it the name up at the top in the northeast of the seat is very white, very working class, quite poor, particularly the Gorton bit, but the Denton parts are often thought of as sort of respectable working class type council estates. But all in all, territory where if you were to look at last year's local elections, you'd be expecting Reform to do very well. But that's only about a third of the seat, 40% of the seat by population. And then when you
Mm.
take the wards going down to the southwest, I described in my blog, I described the thing as looking like a battle axe.
Yeah.
It's a big sort of head of the axe, and you've got a big long thin handle, and that's 3 or 4 wards down in Manchester City Council area that are all very ethnically diverse. They have a lot of students in them because they're sort of just to the east of the university. I was actually driving through them on the way to the lecture hall today. And there's a lot of young professionals as well, because again, the university is a big employer in that part of South Manchester. And if you were to say to somebody like me, I'm looking at a ward that's got lots of Muslims in it, lots of young professionals, and lots of students. What's likely to be happening there politically? I would say, well, probably that's the place where Labour has been strong in the past and they're not so strong now because it's losing support to the Greens and maybe to the Workers' Party or Independents. And that's exactly what's happened in that part of South Manchester. So what we
Mm.
have is a seat that in the aggregate looks quite Labour, but is in fact a seat of two very different halves. And in the two halves, or one third, 2/3, Labour are losing in different directions. You've got a chunk where you could say this is the kind of place where reform are a problem for the Labour Party, and then you've got a chunk where reform are basically not likely to be a feature of the election at all, but where you would see a lot of Labour to Green competition, which is why what we end up with is a three-cornered fight.
So, pulling back, I've just taken you down into the depths of this constituency, pulling it back up and out, if I may, for a second, to by-elections and at this stage in a parliament. Um, is there anything to be drawn from that? What could you typically say about turnout? What might you typically say about an unpopular government? Do those do those things interact with, if we just take it purely on a by-election at this stage in this kind of a parliament, can we say anything about that before we get back into the nitty-gritty of the seat?
Yes, it's a great question. I mean, there's one iron rule with by-elections, which is that incumbent parties tend to do badly in them.
Mm.
So it, I believe the Hartlepool by-election in the last Parliament was the first by-election in about 50 years where the governing party gained a seat and their vote went up a lot.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it,
And that was very seismic at the time, of course, to be positive for the
it,
Conservative Party. Seems strange now to say that, but it was, wasn't it?
and was nearly career-ending for Keir Starmer, a theme we may return to in terms of this
Indeed.
election. So the question typically, if you have a by-election in an incumbent party seat, well, there's two questions: is how low will they go, and will they lose the seat? Have they
Yeah.
got enough of a crash pad? And if you look at this seat, normally you would say they're probably going to hold on because Labour start in this seat with 51%.
Mm.
It's only 70 seats in the country, 71, where the Labour Party got an absolute majority of the vote in 2024. So they have over 400 seats in the Commons, but most of those seats were very fragmented in their voting behaviour, and you don't have a big Labour majority. In this seat, more than half of those who voted Labour, and the ones who didn't split evenly between Reform and the Greens, which means Labour have massive majority. So you would normally say, okay, even if they take a big hit here, which we would expect
Mm.
from by-election with an unpopular
Mm.
incumbent government, they should be able to hold on. The problem is this government is so unpopular, this prime minister is so unpopular that really all bets are off. I don't really think, in fact, if you were to ask me to put some pins on the map in terms of Labour seats, I would think would be safe in a by-election. I wouldn't be putting many pins in the map at all. I really don't think there are any places where any Labour MP would be safe in a
Mm.
by-election contest. All of that said, one asterisk to that is if Andy Burnham had run here, I suspect it would have been a safe hold for Labour, simply because he does have a lot of personal pull in the Greater Manchester area. He is broadly a very popular politician. And crucially, given the unusual demographic divisions in this seat, he has pull across all of those divides. He could keep together that Big Tent Labour coalition, whereas I don't really think the Labour candidate that they do have, she's going to struggle with that.
Can,
Um,
can I ask you about that Burnham fact for a second? As somebody,
yeah,
you live up in Manchester. So that, by what you're saying, there is evidence that backs up this idea that, Burnham is a very popular politician up in that area. Well, potentially, I mean, nationally, he seems to poll well. He seems to poll well with Labour voters. He seems to poll well with other kinds of voters. So that narrative isn't political spin. It is backed up by facts. Is that what you would say?
that's correct. If you look at the net approval ratings of all Labour politicians, and indeed you can throw in all Tory politicians and all Reform politicians as well, the number that have net positive approval ratings is very small.
Yeah.
Some of the ones who do are people where, actually 70% of people say they don't know who that is. So
Yes.
the net
Yeah.
positive,
Burnham has name recognition,
he
right?
has name recognition, partly because of COVID and the whole King of the North stuff and the clashes with the national government. He was on the national TV a lot.
Yes.
He has name recognition and he has net positive approval ratings. That's a very rare combination these days. So even if one looked just at national data, you would expect him to be, an asset on the ballot. But if you
And
look,
oh, sorry.
but
Go on.
if you're in Greater Manchester, he won every single council area in Greater Manchester in his last mayoral contest, and overall won about two-thirds of the vote. So he's exceptionally popular up here. The votes in the ballots don't lie on that front.
And actually, on that point, so we've heard that part of the reason for the NEC subcommittee blocking his candidacy for this was that they didn't want to fight an expensive mayoral election, um, and that there was a risk that actually he would lose. Oh, sorry, not him. He would step down, but I mean that the Labour would lose the Greater Manchester mayoralty to Reform. Is that a fair? Is that is it is it fair of the Labour government and the Labour Party to fear that? Do you think that is grounded in fact that was a risk if let's say Andy Burnham had run as a candidate and the mayoralty had come free?
Yeah, I mean, very often in politics, you get situations where two very different things are true simultaneously. It is true that the decision to block Burnham had like quite an obvious factional motivation behind it. It is also true that there is a strong objective reason not to want to let him go, because him running and winning would have triggered the largest by-election the country's ever seen by an absolute mile. You're talking about a by-election with a constituency of several million people. That's not a trivial
Mm.
operation. It's expensive, it's unnecessary, it would have irritated a lot of people. So that argument, look, Andy, they elected you for 4 years, and we don't think it makes sense to have another election in such a huge constituency after two. That makes sense. Then the political argument about Labour might lose it, that is also, I think, true, partly because we just don't know how much of Labour's vote in a Greater Manchester mayoral election is actually an Andy Burnham personal vote, because there's
Mm.
never been an election up here where Andy Burnham's not on the ballot.
Yeah.
Um, Also, and this factor I think got missed in some of the discussion, the legislation to change the electoral system in mayoral contests back to what's known as the supplemental vote hasn't passed yet.
Yeah.
And if you had this election under first past the post, you could easily have the problem that Labour have in Gorton and Denton of a split vote, but on an enormous scale. So you could have a
Mm.
situation where the Greens and Labour split the left vote evenly and Reform come through the middle and end up in charge of the whole of Greater Manchester. That was not an impossible scenario. So they actually did have a strong case, and I think it is another example of the degree of weakness that Starmer has internally in Labour and the degree of distrust towards him and his team amongst the party, that even though they did have a very strong argument to make for blocking Burnham, simply nobody believed it.
That's well, yeah, you've hit the nail on the head for where we're at currently with the Labour leadership. Um, so what's been quite interesting moving on from that sense of you risk reform and that being uh that's actually become a strategy. It's become a slogan even for Gorton and Denton. In fact, from what I can tell, every of the sort of the three major parties, which actually are Greens, Reform, and Labour, you seem to have them running on a negative slogan. So Labour are claiming only we could stop reform. The Greens are voting, saying only we can stop reform, and they're both claiming some data which you please do go into explaining because they've got these bar charts on their leaflets. We should talk about the data being used. So that they're going with that, and then Reform are going with vote Reform and get rid of Keir Starmer.
Mm.
Nobody seems to be saying vote for us and get this policy or this angle. So yeah, talk about that because I particularly want to know about those bar charts because it's quite something to go to a voter and say, look, that's our slogan and this is why. Here's your evidence. Is there evidence, Rob, for this?
I mean, firstly, on the point about these very negative campaigns, I think there is a logic to that. In a way, it's all three parties understanding the voter psychology in a
Mm,
by-election and recognizing that voters know that when you've got a party that's got 400 seats in Parliament, a by-election is not going to change who's in charge. So it's really an opportunity to take a whack at somebody. And so
yeah.
they're basically just coming up with a different argument about who you do and
Who
don't
who
want to
you
whack.
whack? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Um, in terms of the bar chart shenanigans, so I mean, like the Reform, incidentally, they say whack Keir Starmer because that's all they can say, and they don't have to worry about a split vote. They have to worry about a too small vote.
Mm,
So I think if you look at the underlying demographics, it's really advantage left in this seat. Even like in 2019, peak Boris Johnson year, add together the Brexit Party and Tory vote, and it's like 30%, 25%, much lower, incidentally, than in the by-election we had last year in Runcorn and Helsby, where there was a decent chunk of the Tory vote that Reform squashed down. There's nothing here. It's like 5, 6% or something like that here.
mm,
So they
mm.
really have to hope for an even split on the left. That's their only route to victory.
Yeah.
And I think the Wax Starmer argument makes sense because they probably think there are at least some non-voters, some
Mm.
left voters, but like moderate voters, swing voters, who would be attracted by that. So it's just they're taking the reform politics out of it entirely and turning it into just a hit the government type argument. We're the
Yeah.
best to hit the government with. Um, then on the left, you've got the the bloodbath of the bar charts, which is deeply distressing and painful for me as someone who loves good data visualization, watching these crimes against understanding being committed on leaflets. And the reason for that is quite simple. It's really not clear who the bigger party on the left is, and you can make a pretty cogent argument for either of them. So if
Mm.
you want to argue for Labour, you would say parts of this seat have been Labour in every election but one since 1906.
Wow.
Labour defeated Winston Churchill Jr. in a by-election here in the 1960s. That's as close as it ever came to going into anybody else's hands. Most of the wards typically vote two-thirds Labour in most of the local elections as well as. So you would say, obviously, the Labour Party is best placed to be the
Mm.
anti-reform here because
Yeah.
they always have been.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas if you're the Greens, what you say is Labour are polling at 17% nationally, 18% nationally. Keir Starmer is incredibly unpopular. Clearly, the Labour vote is going to collapse here. And what you're going to be left with, and where it's going to collapse to is it's going to collapse to us.
Mm.
And they will point at Caerphilly and say,
Mm.
if you were living in Caerphilly last year, you had these vans going around from Labour all the time saying only Labour can stop reform, and it was nonsense because, as it turned out, Plaid definitely could stop reform, and in the end, all the voters there figured it out and went behind Plaid. And the other advantage, so the big advantage for Labour is history, along with organisation. They do
Mm.
have strong organisation in Greater Manchester. That's something that's benefited Burnham, and Burnham has helped to build, of course.
Mm.
The big advantages the Greens have is the national polling context, but also they have an additional psychological advantage in terms of the psychology of by-elections because they can play the same game as Reform. What the
Mm.
Greens can say, as Plaid said in Caerphilly, is if you want to stop Reform and you want to give Keir Starmer a bloody nose, guess what? You can, for once, have your cake and eat it too, because you get both of those outcomes by voting for us as the Green Party. And in particular, and I think this is the thing that's most hazardous for Labour. I've been arguing for a while that Labour has been dangerously neglecting its kind of progressive wing, that
Yeah.
that there's an understandable national electoral logic to tacking to the centre and trying to neutralise issues on the right, appeal to the median voter. But the risk is you antagonise sections of your left vote.
Yeah.
And right now, a message of only Labour can stop reform signals to these voters that Labour is still not interested in what they have to say and is still
Mm.
not responding to them and still not listening to them. And the Greens can lean very heavily into that and say the only way you're ever going to get Labour to listen to you is to vote against them. Because they will carry on taking advantage of you until you change until you force them to
Mm.
change course, which then becomes a message very akin, of course, to the reform message, but because the psychology of by-elections very much is, do you want to give the government a slap and get them to see sense? It's working with the grain of how
Yeah.
people tend to think about these.
The Caerphilly example is interesting. Is there a difference in terms of the way that voters, when they think tactically, did they have more data points in Caerphilly? Because Gorton and Denton is a new seat. Um, I don't know. Was there different information? Were they doing chart crimes on leaflets in Caerphilly as well, or was there just a really good ground game from Plaid Cymru there?
A little bit of all of the things you've just mentioned. So there were like crimes against data visualization in Caerphilly as well. Some horrible charts going around from both Labour and Plaid based on dubious data sources. But crucially, there was good national Welsh polling. There
Mm.
were regular polls for the Welsh Assembly that showed that Plaid was now the largest party on the left, which Plaid were using very aggressively and which really undercut Labour's argument that they were the only or dominant force on the left. Now, of course, Labour could riposte with, yes, but that's all of Wales. It's not Caerphilly.
Yeah.
But it was it was a bar chart with a big green bar that was based on real data, and people could definitely draw their own conclusions on that. But I think also one of the things that's been forgotten about Caerphilly is that the guy who won it for Plaid he'd been on the council in Caerphilly since 19. I mean, if you were to get the AI to design a person who could like really appeal locally, you really wouldn't. You couldn't do much better than this guy.
Yeah. He's got
Council
an
since
amazing story, that guy, hasn't he?
75. He's run the council twice. every general election he stood for Plaid since 1983. I mean, there can't be many voters in that seat who aren't aware of him. So that really
Amazing.
made their job a lot easier. I mean, because some of them probably like, well, maybe we should just let him, because they were also abolishing the seat 6 months later. It's like maybe let's just let him win one. Come on.
Oh,
Whereas the
they're
Green,
abolishing. I didn't know that. Sorry, they're abolishing the seat.
yeah, because the electoral system in Wales is changing.
Oh, of
So
course.
Paul
Yes.
Clark's now got to win again in a completely different electoral system. He'd probably be all right, to be honest, because the Pride are doing very well in the poll. But yeah, so I think many people felt like let him have his moment. But the Greens, it'll be much tougher for them. They don't have that level of organisation. Some of the wards in this seat they've never run in. Some of
Mm,
the other ones they've run in but not done very well. They do have a lot of potential in the Muslim community. The Workers' Party, who got some decent votes here, they're not standing and have not endorsed the Greens, but they said it's important that both Labour and Reform be defeated in this seat. I think you can kind of draw
mm.
some pretty clear conclusions about which way
Yeah, they
they're.
got as almost as close as they could get, but didn't
Yeah,
quite. Yeah.
but because they were very active in the last local elections here in 2024, the Greens have got to build like organisational strength in that community from a standing start. And in other parts of the seat, they just haven't run. Their candidate is not from this part of Greater Manchester. She's a councillor in Trafford, in Hale Ward. I mean, I grew up in Surrey. If I wanted to go to a bit of Manchester that reminded me of where I grew up, I would go to Hale Ward.
Yep. Yep.
Very well off,
Very
lots of
nice. Very nice part of the world. Hale.
it's a very nice part of the world, but very different to Gorton and Denton. So
Mm,
her campaigning experience in Trafford may not necessarily be much of a preparation for running around here. On the other hand, we do have two of the nation's largest universities here, and the reports I've been hearing this week are there are just hordes of young green activists out there
mm,
delivering leaflets. So even if they didn't have organizational capacity a few years ago, it could be very different right now. And that is another factor that could it could turn the Labour strength into a weakness because I think the Labour machine around here has not had to run an intensely contested election like that very often because they've traditionally been so strong. And they
mm.
lost one of the wards here in 2024 against the Workers' Party, lost the deputy leader of the council.
Oh, right. Where was that ward but based in that bottom end of the axe, as you were
In
talking
the
about?
bottom end, in the axe handle, yeah, a ward called Longsight, majority Muslim ward.
Yeah.
Deputy leader of
Interesting.
the council look for Rahman, not the London one, different look for Rahman. Um, he lost to a Workers' Party candidate, and again, it was very much a case of I think a Labour Party machine completely taken by surprise. So, in
Mm,
fact, if you look through the past 20 years of Labour electoral history, there is a repeated theme of local and regional Labour parties being taken by surprise because they've kind of got used to just being, making the weather politically and not really knowing how to react when something emerges that's organised and motivated and they don't quite know what to do with it. So I think there is a chance of that.
mm.
Um, yeah,
And of course, the candidate you mentioned, the Green candidate. I noticed that she's, as with many these days, very uh, active on social media. I mean, Zach Polanski's done a lot on that front. Um, I was quite impressed in the first video I saw her. She had addressed the flags up on flagpoles with by saying that if this is a statement about, let's get our country back, then come and volunteer in our community centres. We want you've worked hard, come and help us. I thought that's quite a positive message, quite a smart message. Of course, the glare of this campaign, I mean, where are we? We've got just under 3 weeks to go. Given its national significance, which we'll come to in a second, this is quite something for these candidates to go through. I mean, these are, as you say, local councillors. Now they're stepping up to the plate, not only to become an MP in the national parliament, but in a totemic by-election. So I don't know how you think the candidates, each of them, will perform through this. I mean, the Reform candidate obviously has a experience at national media. I don't know if you want to mention anything in particular about any of these candidates, Rob. Do you think actually, to be fair, do you think the candidate will be a factor? Do we touched on it for Caerphilly. What do you make of that for Gorton Denton?
I do think it makes a difference, and especially because we know this is a race that could go any of three ways. I think candidacies make a lot of difference. I mean, I'll declare an interest for your listeners. I wrote a book with the Reform candidate. He wasn't a Reform politician back then. We wrote a book about UKIP, not because we wanted to join UKIP or become UKIP politicians, at least at that stage. He
Mm.
he that have gone in that direction. But he now has a GB News show. He has regular sort of national media experience. He's very message disciplined. I've watched some of his social media as well, and it's been interesting. He's been like hitting all the kind of local campaign beat type messages that you would expect to see from a really disciplined campaigner. And this is his first ever election campaign. So
Mm,
he's pumping out a lot of content that I think really it pushes the kind of buttons you would expect to see. So he is the one who is most likely to stand up well in terms of the national media glare that you mentioned. He's the least experienced in terms of local elections, but he seems to be learning quite fast. And then in terms of the Greens, I agree with you that their presence on social media has been considerably more obvious than Labour's.
mm,
Labour's campaign looks like your kind of traditional
mm,
local candidate for a local community, represents a ward just down the road and stuff like this. But as far as I know, she didn't even have any social media presence at all at the time that she was picked.
wow.
And I think seems to be leaning quite heavily on the National Party. Whether or not that is a strength or a weakness in terms of the overall vote, I think is hard to say.
Mm,
I think sometimes the influence of social media is over-egged in
mm,
general. But the disparate communities in this seat, I mean, it probably matters quite a lot with students. I think that's true. But with Muslim voters, I think the media ecosystem that matters to Muslim voters, as Labour discovered to their cost in 2024, is quite different. And I think it will be all but impossible for outsiders like us to have a sense of who is performing well in
yeah.
that. The
I,
campaigns, but they won't tell us. But we won't be able to tell for sure because it'll all be happening in WhatsApp networks and things like that,
yeah.
and in you know sort of social media formats that are just not the mainstream ones that we're used to. And then, but then there's also the question of whether or not localness and local organisation matters. Both Labour and the Greens have made a lot of hay about the fact that Matthew Goodwin is, as is very obvious, like me, when he opens his mouth, not a Manchester native, a southerner, a
Mm,
carpetbagger, an
mm,
outsider, etc., etc. And Matthew has looked to neutralise this by pointing out that he went to university in Salford, which is true, that he worked in the Manchester University, which is also true, that his granddad worked in a factory up here, which is probably true. It seems like a bit of a. It reminds me of when I was going to school, the people who wanted to support Alex Ferguson's Man United would point to grandparents or great grandparents who'd worked in a mill or something like that. I think there's a risk of it backfiring if you go too, you
yeah.
start touching credulity with your links and stuff like this. I think on the whole, though, for the kinds of voters that consider reform, I don't think candidacy is as important and
Mm,
localness is as important because I think for a lot of the time the reform vote is essentially, you know, do you want to stick two fingers up to the Westminster system as a whole, yes or no? Do you like Nigel Farage, yes or no? The individual candidates, I think, are less important. It didn't matter, for example, up in Lincolnshire that Richard Tice has absolutely no connection to Lincolnshire. Nobody
yeah.
cared. Um,
Yeah.
I think with
Okay.
the
Go on.
Greens thing, the localness could be important. And
Mm,
if, for example, Labour were to narrowly pip the Greens at the post, I suspect one of the things that we might be looking at is whether or not the fact that they picked like an ultra local candidate who's been a councillor for over a decade, maybe that helped.
yeah. Tying it then back up to the national politics. As we speak, as we record right now, it's widely accepted that this week has been the worst for Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. Um, how significant will the result of this by-election be? What would be a good result? Let's start with what would be a good result for Keir Starmer, and then we can talk about what would be a good result for the Labour Party. Maybe it's a different answer, but yeah, what would be a good result for Keir Starmer in this by-election? And does it matter, in fact?
It does, and a good result is easy to define, and in a way, it's a weird situation where actually very low expectations could, in
Mm,
retrospect, prove to be helpful to
yeah,
Labour. Because
yeah,
if you drop me into this office pod that I'm recording from 3 years ago and say there's a by-election happening in Gorton and Denton, what do you think the result would be? I'd say comfortable Labour hold. If I didn't see any of the polling or anything like that, just like based on like vibes, based on like history, I would have said easy Labour hold. The fact that everyone now expects Labour to lose, I mean, the
Mm,
bookmaker odds is never a good guide for what will actually happen, but are a good guide for what people think is going to happen.
yeah.
Currently, Labour are like 4 or 5 to 1, so people clearly think Labour are going to lose in a seat where they haven't lost since 1906. That means if they win, which really shouldn't be a surprise, it will be a surprise,
Yeah.
and and a positive surprise, and that can then provide a turnaround narrative, a comeback narrative. Keir Starmer has lived this story before, actually, because that's the Batley and Spend story as well. That was a
Mm,
seat by business losing or being in trouble in 2021. They held it. Everyone treated that as a big sort of against the odds victory, and a comeback narrative got going. So I think it would definitely take the pressure off him in the short run if they were to hold the seat. A bad result for them is to lose, and the worst result of all, I think, for them is if they were to come third. Of course,
mm,
that's the worst result, but particularly if they were to come third and the Greens were to win,
yeah.
because what that would signal is that Caerphilly was not, in fact, a one-off driven by a very experienced local candidate, but in fact, if you're a Labour MP in a seat where Reform are not competitive, you may well be in trouble anyway. Because parties to your left are coming for you and they're going to eat your lunch. And that's probably one of the groups in the PLP that Starmer and his team would be hoping to rely on in terms of ballast. That at least those MPs will stick with them through thick and thin because they're not going to be as worried. But at that point, they will be worried. So that would then be the situation that might trigger something of a stampede
So,
with
yeah,
them.
a destabilizing for Starmer would be a Green win and Labour coming third,
Yeah.
or just a Green win, maybe. Or you think if Labour ran them close, it could, they could still
A
argue
Green
it.
win with Labour running them close, I think, would be less destabilising because a third place in a seat where you've won since 1906. I mean, the Greens will use that then everywhere
Yeah.
and say, well, look Labour have just done. They're kaput, and it will become, there will be more bar chart crimes as a result, and so on. And we've got one of the things I think we are going to wonder about whatever the result of this is why did they choose to do it in February when they could have waited to do it at the same time as the locals?
Amazing, isn't it? What an
It's,
amazing decision that was.
it's bizarre. And it's generated a massive hostage to fortune because if they do have a really dreadful night, then they've just launched like 200 green ward campaigns overnight, all of whom will say we can do the same thing here as our national party did in Gorton and Denton. Just help us do it. Um, and that will be very. I mean, regardless of how successful those campaigns are, they will immediately panic a lot of councillors and a lot of MPs. So very destabilising.
Also, actually, to your point, just thinking aloud about this, given that a lot of university students, then of course this is taking place in term time, I guess.
That
Is
time,
it?
yes,
Yeah, yeah. So they're around, and
they
perhaps
are.
perhaps the rain will put them off pounding the streets. I don't know. Mind you, if you go to university in Manchester, what do you expect? Is that a bit of a nasty comment? I don't mean that to be nasty.
It's been drier up here in the last
Has
couple of months
it?
than
Oh,
south.
oh goodness me. Yeah,
Up
okay.
north, the
I
dry
take it.
weather.
I take it back. It's just every time I've gone to Manchester, it rains, but that's just
Yeah.
me. Okay, so right, I'm not going to make you say who you think is going to win. You've sketched out paths to victory. You've sketched out the constituency. We've looked at the national implications. I said the national implications for Starmer. I mean, is there a broader Labour Party lesson that could be taken from this, or would it be wrong to overinterpret one by-election?
Well, it's always risky to overinterpret any by-election because they are subject to unusual dynamics. People do know that what they're voting in is not a national general election, and they won't necessarily behave the same way
Mm,
outside of by-elections. But I would come back to the scenario where the Greens win and Labour get pushed into third, or Labour vote just drops really really far. Maybe they still hold on to second. That is very dangerous to Labour because I think the the national message that the Starmer government has been looking to frame the next election around already for much
mm,
of so certainly since the May local elections last year is essentially it's us or reform. They want to
yeah,
turn the next general election into another election where there's a lot of tactical voting because they know most of the seats are seats where they're first or second place. So they are currently well placed to be the beneficiaries of that. To basically say, you may be a bit disappointed in us. You may not like everything we've done. You may not like everything we say, but the alternative is much, much worse. The danger of a Green win, particularly coming 6 months after a Plaid win, is that it will say to a lot of voters who might be open to that kind of tactical argument, you don't have to accept second best. You don't have to accept half a loaf. You can have the kind of politics you want and it can beat reform. And that could be very dangerous for Labour, even if it doesn't actually deliver in a general election 40 or 50 seats. If enough voters come to believe in that possibility, it's one of those self-fulfilling prophecies.
Mm,
It becomes all but impossible for Labour to squeeze them because they will point to results like this and say, well, no, we're not willing to hold our noses. Sorry, we think we can do it. And we're going to try and do it because we think we'd be better off with that. So it becomes a very hazardous scenario for Labour because it directly undercuts their electoral strategy. We're still years out, of course, from the general election, but already that strategy becomes much, much harder to pull off.
yeah,
Because people will just say, well, no, we don't have to do that. We can see from the results that it's not like that.
yeah. And well, I'll leave everyone with this thought from the work we do at Blonde Money, which is, of course, that we think that election will come much sooner than 3 years' time. But I'll save that for another podcast episode as to how and where we get to that. But there we go. Leave you on that
Someone,
cliffhanger, Rob.
someone who'll be contracted to write a book about that election. That really, every time you write about that, and I'm a long time fan of your emails, it makes me worried.
Well, okay, good. Okay, good. Let's leave it on that worried note. Well, I mean, one thing's for sure that there's certainly followers of politics and economics have got an awful lot of stuff to digest in the days and weeks ahead, which for you and for me is both fascinating and frightening, I think. Thank you so much, Rob. Please do anyone get in touch with feedback. Always keen to hear it. Helen@blondemoney.co.uk. Obviously, I'm also on all the social media as Rob is too. You're active on X, aren't you, Rob?
Less active on X these days. I mean, I've got an X account and I do put stuff out there sometimes. But if you
Blue
want to read
Sky?
Blue Sky, I'm on Blue Sky, and of course my Substack is the Swingometer for those who are interested in that.
Yeah, sorry, what was the name of it again, Rob?
The Swingometer.
The Swingometer, of course. What else could it be? Brilliant stuff. Please, do sign up to that. It is very it's anything I needed to know about Gorton Denton, I learnt there. So, and I look forward to your analysis post. Actually, do we know when we'll get the result? Or is it going to be one of these ones where we have to wait till
Oof.
midday the next day?
It will be in the wee small hours of Friday morning,
Ooh.
probably 3 or 4 in the morning.
Ooh. Okay. Well, I look forward to the Substack at 5 a.m. then. No pressure. I'm joking. I'm joking. Right. Good stuff. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rob. Speak to you again soon. Thank you. Oh, where's that now?